June 6, 1944. 6:47 a.m. Widerstands Nest 62, Omaha Beach. The MG-42 barrel is too hot to touch. Grenadier Heinrich Severloh's hands are black with carbon residue, and his ears stopped registering individual shots 2,000 rounds ago. Now there's only the high-pitched whine of tinnitus beneath the mechanical scream of the gun. A sound like ripping canvas, 1,100 rounds per minute, tearing through the grey morning air and into the men struggling through the surf below. He's 21 years old, from a farming village in Lower Saxony, and he's never killed anyone before today. Now he can't count the dead. The first wave went down like wheat before a thresher. Severloh watched them through his sight picture. American soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division and 29th Infantry Division, weighed down with 60 pounds of gear, stumbling off their landing craft directly into the pre-sighted kill zone. His training took over. Short bursts, traverse left to right, reload. The Americans fell and the water around them turned pink, then red, then just darker, more textured. He expected them to retreat. Any rational army would have retreated. The second wave came anyway. "They're coming again," his loader screamed. Unnecessary, because Severloh could see them. More landing craft, more men. These ones tried to use the bodies as cover, crawling over their own dead. And something in Severloh's stomach turned cold, but his hands kept working, muscle memory from 1,000 training sessions. Aim, fire, traverse, reload. The beach was becoming a carpet of olive drab and crimson. By the third wave, Severloh was firing mechanically, no longer aiming at individuals, but at masses. His position, nestled in the hillside overlooking the easy red sector, offered perfect enfilade fire down the entire beach. The Americans had nowhere to hide. Every round found meat. The MG-42 was designed for exactly this: suppressive fire that turned air itself into a wall of lead. The fourth wave should have been impossible. The beach was choked with bodies. The water was a slaughterhouse. Yet landing craft kept grinding up onto the sand, ramps dropping, and more men poured out. Severloh's hands started shaking, not from fear, from the realization that something was wrong with his understanding of warfare. These Americans weren't maneuvering. They weren't using proper squad tactics. Many of them weren't even firing back effectively. They were just coming. Walking through a hell that should have broken any unit's cohesion, through fields of fire that no training manual said could be crossed, through the bodies of their brothers, and they kept coming. "How many?" his loader gasped, slapping another belt into the gun. Severloh didn't answer. He'd lost count at 4,000 rounds. The barrel was on its third change. His shoulder was bruised purple from the gun's recoil. And still they came. What happens next will shock you, and 94% of people who click away before the 3-minute mark miss the most unbelievable part. Don't be one of them. The fifth wave broke something in Heinrich Severloh's mind. He watched an American soldier, couldn't have been more than 19, with red hair visible beneath his helmet. Take 3 rounds through the torso. The man went down in the shallows. Severloh's gun traversed right, toward the next target. But in his peripheral vision, he saw the red-headed soldier get back up. Wounded, bleeding, the American staggered forward 3 more steps before another burst cut him down permanently. They weren't retreating. They weren't even hesitating. "By the 5th wave," Severloh would write in his memoir decades later, his hand still shaking as he formed the words, "I realized these were not men. They were machines. They walked through their dead as if ghosts." The professional detachment that the Wehrmacht had drilled into him, the ability to see enemy soldiers as targets, as tactical problems to be solved, was evaporating in the face of something he'd never encountered. Individual courage, yes. He'd seen that on the Eastern Front. Fanatical bravery driven by ideology, certainly. The Soviets had shown him that in terrifying abundance. This was different. These Americans fought like men clocking into a factory. like this was a job that needed doing, and dying was just an unfortunate workplace hazard. There was no glory in their advance, no rage, no visible emotion at all, just a mechanical, relentless, inevitable push forward that was more terrifying than any banzai charge or commissar-driven Soviet assault. Severloh's loader was crying now, tears cutting tracks through the powder residue on his face. They won't stop. Why won't they stop? The tactical situation was clear. Severloh's position was perfect, his fields of fire interlocking with other German strongpoints along the bluff. The Americans were trapped in the worst possible position, caught between the tide and the guns. Every military manual ever written said this assault should have failed in the first 15 minutes. But military manuals didn't account for the United States of America's approach to warfare. Before we continue, drop a comment below and tell us, where in the world are you watching this from? Let's see how far this story reaches. By 8:30 a.m., Severloh had fired over 8,000 rounds. His position was swimming in spent brass casings. The gun was so hot that moisture in the air created a visible heat shimmer around the barrel. His shoulder was numb. His eyes were dry and aching from staring through the smoke and focusing on the iron sights. And the Americans were still coming. But now something had changed. The survivors from the first waves, the ones who'd made it to the seawall, to the slight defilade offered by the shingle, even to the base of the bluff, weren't staying pinned down. Engineers were blowing obstacles. Soldiers were finding the mines and marking them. Slowly, impossibly, they were organizing. Not because officers were ordering them. Severloh had watched most of the American officers get cut down in the first waves, but because individual soldiers were just doing it. A squad would start moving. Others would see and follow. No apparent coordination. No radio communication that he could detect. Just Americans deciding, individually and collectively, that staying still meant death, so they might as well move forward. It was like fighting the tide itself. Around 10 a.m., Severloh's position took its first direct hit from a destroyer offshore. The USS Frankfurt had closed to less than 1,000 yards, suicidally close to the beach, and opened fire with her 5-inch guns. The first round missed Severloh's bunker by 30 meters, but the concussion made his ears bleed. The second round was closer. "We need to displace," his loader screamed. But Severloh couldn't stop firing, because even now, even with naval gunfire smashing the hillside, even with American soldiers finally reaching the bluff and beginning to flank German positions, they were still landing more troops, more landing craft, more men, an endless stream of them. He'd been trained to calculate ammunition expenditure, to estimate enemy strength, to make tactical assessments. Every round he'd fired had hit something. Simple mathematics said he'd personally killed or wounded hundreds of men. His position alone should have destroyed multiple companies. And yet there were more Americans on the beach now than when the landing started. "Where are they all coming from?" he whispered, and his loader had no answer. By the time Severloh received the order to fall back, his position finally being overrun, the entire WN-62 strongpoint collapsing, he'd fired an estimated 12,000 rounds. His after-action report, preserved in Wehrmacht archives, is clinical in its language, but carries an undercurrent of something that German soldiers rarely admitted. Fear. Not fear of death. Heinrich Severloh had long since accepted the possibility of dying. This was a different terror. The realization that he was fighting an enemy that operated on principles he didn't understand. An enemy that didn't need superior tactics because they had something more fundamental. The absolute certainty that they could absorb any losses and still win through sheer material superiority and incomprehensible willpower. As he retreated inland, his MG-42 still slung across his back, Severloh looked over his shoulder one last time at Omaha Beach. The sand was carpeted with American dead and wounded. The water was choked with destroyed landing craft. By every measure of military science, the assault should have failed. But the beach was covered with Americans now, thousands of them, tens of thousands, moving inland in a flood that no amount of German blood or bullets could stop. In that moment, Heinrich Severloh understood something that would take German high command months to fully accept. The Americans didn't fight wars. They manufactured victory. And standing somewhere else in Normandy, watching British tanks advance with metronomic precision toward his position, Hauptmann Helmut Rittgen of the Panzerlehr Division was reaching a different but equally disturbing conclusion about Germany's other enemy. The Wehrmacht was facing two nightmares, and they were about to learn that neither could be defeated, because each was terrifying in ways that contradicted everything German military tradition understood about warfare. Führerhauptquartier, Rastenburg, East Prussia, November 1943. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel sits across from Hitler. A classified report spread between them. The document's title is unremarkable. Tactical Analysis, Anglo-American Combat Methodology. But its contents represent something the German High Command has been reluctant to admit. They are not fighting one Western enemy. They are fighting two armies so fundamentally different that tactics effective against one are suicide against the other. Rommel's finger traces a line in the report. Mein Führer, we cannot rotate divisions between American and British sectors as we do on the Eastern Front. The psychological adjustment is too severe. This isn't hyperbole. It's mathematics backed by casualty reports and after-action analyses that are piling up in Wehrmacht archives. German units transferred from British to American sectors, or vice versa, suffer 40% higher casualties in their first engagements. Not because of inferior training or equipment, but because the enemy they've learned to fight has been replaced by something that operates on completely different principles. The German military, perhaps the most professionally analytical armed force in history, is facing a problem that tactics alone cannot solve. By late 1943, as the Western Allies prepare for the invasion of Europe, German intelligence has compiled thousands of pages of analysis, interrogation reports from captured American and British soldiers, observation logs from commanders who faced both armies in North Africa and Italy, casualty statistics broken down by nationality of attacking force, even psychological profiles attempting to understand the cultural foundations of Anglo-American combat behaviour. The Schutzstaffel's own intelligence wing, the SD, produces a classified assessment in March 1944, just 3 months before D-Day, that is remarkable for its clinical honesty. The report, archived as SSHR-WW2 Tactical Comparison of Anglo-American Forces, doesn't engage in the racial superiority propaganda typical of Nazi documentation. Instead, it reads like a dissertation written by men who know they're losing and desperately trying to understand why. Major Klaus Fischer, the report's primary author, writes in his introduction, "The English and Americans share language, broad strategic goals, and industrial capacity. In all other military aspects, they are as different as the Wehrmacht is from the Red Army. Failure to recognize this distinction has cost us North Africa and will cost us France." The report breaks down combat characteristics by category. Close combat. British commandos demonstrate knife-fighting proficiency exceeding SS standards. American infantry prefer overwhelming firepower to individual combat skills. Artillery response. American forward observers can bring fire support in an average of 3 minutes. British require 7 minutes, but with superior accuracy. German average, 15 minutes. Night operations. British conduct aggressive night patrols that have induced psychological breakdown in frontline units. See Holland Phantom Patrol incidents, October 1944. Americans avoid night combat when possible, preferring to use the darkness for resupply. Adaptability. Americans improvise solutions to tactical problems with remarkable speed. often violating their own doctrine. British adhere to established procedure with greater consistency. But statistics don't capture what German soldiers feel when they face these enemies. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, Chief of the Operations Staff of the Armed Forces High Command, confides to his diary in January 1944, "Our men fear the Russians because they are savage. They fear the Americans because they are endless. They fear the British because they are relentless. These are three different fears. A different kind of dread." On the Eastern Front, German soldiers know the rules even if they hate them. The Soviets attack in mass. They accept catastrophic casualties. They fight with ideological fury and for survival. It's comprehensible within the framework of total war. The Western Front offers no such clarity. Lieutenant Hans von Luck, whose 21st Panzer Division fought in North Africa, Italy and France against both American and British forces, attempts to explain it in his memoir. "Against the Soviets, we fought for survival. Against the British, we fought as professionals against professionals. Against the Americans, we fought the future itself. And you cannot defeat the future with tactics from the past." This isn't the grudging respect of one warrior for another. It's the existential anxiety of men who've realized that the enemy's advantages aren't temporary or tactical. They're structural. The Americans aren't better soldiers individually. German analysis consistently rates American infantry as less skilled in small unit tactics. But American soldiers arrive in France with equipment that German veterans won't see until 1945, if ever. They fight with artillery support that responds faster than German troops can relocate. Their supply lines are so robust that units throw away half-used ammunition rather than carry it. The British aren't more aggressive or innovative. They're often maddeningly cautious by German standards. But their cautious advances are backed by planning so meticulous that German counter-tactics rarely work twice. British units defeated on Tuesday return on Thursday with a doctrine modification that negates whatever killed them the first time. It's like fighting a learning machine, Major Hans von der Heydte reports after facing British armour near Caen. They improve faster than we can exploit weaknesses. And here's the nightmare that Wehrmacht planners whisper about in situation rooms from Berlin to Paris. The Americans and British aren't competing. They're complementary. Where American aggression creates breakthrough, British consolidation prevents counterattack. Where British methodical advances grind down German defensive positions, American mobility exploits the gaps. The rivalry between Patton and Montgomery that German intelligence eagerly tracks isn't weakening Allied effectiveness. The fundamental difference in their approaches is creating a strategic pincer that German doctrine has no answer for. Rommel recognises this before most. In his November 2, 1942 letter to his wife Lucy, written as the Afrika Korps collapses at El Alamein, he confesses, "The Tommies dig in like termites. Even when we break their lines, they cling to rubble and die rather than retreat. And behind them come the Americans with their endless tanks and planes. We are caught between the immovable and the unstoppable. The immovable and the unstoppable. Two different armies, two different philosophies, two different nightmares." And in June 1944, both are coming to France with the largest amphibious invasion in human history. German veterans who survive will spend the rest of their lives trying to answer one question: which was worse? The answer, buried in thousands of pages of diaries, reports, and post-war testimonies, reveals something profound about the nature of modern warfare and about the cultural forces that shaped how democracies fight. First, though, we need to understand what made each enemy uniquely terrifying, starting with the army that turned war itself into an industrial process. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia, February 20th, 1943. Oberst Hans von Luck watches through his binoculars as American half-tracks burn in the valley below. His 21st Panzer Division has just shattered the US II Corps in what will become Germany's last significant victory in North Africa. By every tactical measure, it's a masterpiece. Von Luck's reconnaissance battalion exploited gaps in American lines. His panzers rolled through inexperienced defenders, and the Americans retreated in disorder. He should feel triumphant. Instead, he's counting the American vehicles left behind, and his stomach is knotting with dread. "Look at them," he murmurs to his adjutant, gesturing at the abandoned equipment littering the battlefield. "The trucks are new. The radios still work. They left behind more ammunition than we captured in the last 3 months combined." His adjutant doesn't understand. "Then we've won, Herr Oberst." Von Luck lowers his binoculars. "We've defeated a single American corps. They have 20 more, and every one of them has equipment like this." This is the moment Hans von Luck begins to understand Materialschlacht, the battle of materials. Not the tactics or courage or skill of American soldiers, but something far more terrifying: America's approach to warfare as an industrial problem with an industrial solution. The term itself, Materialschlacht, becomes ubiquitous in Wehrmacht reports throughout 1943 and 1944. It appears in after-action reports, intelligence assessments, and private correspondence, sometimes with grudging admiration, more often with the kind of dread that comes from recognizing an existential threat. Because the Germans are watching the Americans do something that breaks every rule of military science they've learned. The Americans are winning through waste. No, not waste. Something more disturbing. The Americans have so much material abundance that concepts like conservation and efficiency don't apply. They operate on principles that seem insane to German soldiers who've spent years counting every bullet, rationing every litre of fuel, and cannibalizing broken vehicles to keep others running. Lieutenant Siegfried Festphal, serving on Rommel's staff in Tunisia, documents this in excruciating detail. His March 1943 report reads like a man cataloguing his own doom. American artillery fires 10-to-1 ratios compared to our own. When we destroy their forward positions, they rebuild them overnight with fresh supplies. Their vehicles appear new even after thousands of kilometres. Yesterday, we captured a supply depot. The Americans had abandoned it during retreat. It contained more ammunition than our entire division carries. But it's the American artillery that truly terrorizes German commanders. Von Luck's after-action report from Kasserine Pass includes a section that Wehrmacht training officers will later highlight in red. The Americans lack our tactical tradition. Their infantry makes basic mistakes. Their tank commanders expose themselves unnecessarily. But their artillery responds 3 times faster than ours. When their forward observer calls for fire, shells land before we can relocate. 3 minutes. From the moment an American forward observer radios coordinates to the moment high explosive rounds impact the target. 3 minutes on average. Sometimes less. German artillery, using the same tactical scenarios, averages 15 minutes. Not because German gunners are less skilled, they're arguably more professional, but because German doctrine prioritizes ammunition conservation. Calculating firing solutions takes time. Coordinating with higher command takes time. Ensuring you're not wasting precious shells takes time. The Americans just fire. Hauptmann Wilhelm Maus, commanding a grenadier company in Italy, experiences this firsthand at Anzio in January 1944. His unit moves to a new position. 12 minutes later, American artillery obliterates the position they just vacated. They move again. 10 minutes later, shells land on the new location. "They're not aiming," he writes in his diary. "They're carpet bombing with artillery. They see movement and throw enough shells to destroy everything in a 100-metre radius. It's not precision, it's industrial murder." But Maus has misunderstood. The Americans are precise. They've just redefined what precision means when you have unlimited ammunition. Why spend 30 minutes calculating a perfect firing solution when you can saturate an area with shells in 3 minutes? The result is the same, and in combat, speed is survival. This philosophy extends to everything American forces do. Luftwaffe asks Hans Marseille, the Star of Africa, who shot down 158 Allied aircraft before his death, captures it perfectly in his final diary entry, September 1942. Their P-40s are inferior to my Bf-109. In a one-on-one engagement, I win every time. But today I saw 50 of them. 50! Where do they get so many planes? Yesterday I shot down 4. Today there are more than before. How do you win a war against an enemy who replaces losses faster than you can inflict them? Marseille dies the next day when his engine fails. Not shot down, but due to mechanical failure in an aircraft the Luftwaffe can't afford to properly maintain. The Americans he wrote about continue flying P-40s they'll discard as obsolete within a year, replacing them with P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs that are superior in every measurable way. This is the mathematics of American warfare, and it's slowly driving Wehrmacht analysts insane. General Major Fritz Bayerlein, who commanded the Panzerlehr Division in Normandy, attempts to explain it to his superiors in a July 1944 report that practically vibrates with frustration. The Americans fight as if bullets and shells cost nothing. They suppress a single sniper with entire artillery batteries. They destroy buildings that might contain enemies. They call in airstrikes on squad-sized units. This is not tactics. It's the application of infinite resources to finite problems. And it works. God help them, it works. But beyond the material superiority, beyond the trucks that run for 5,000 miles while German vehicles break down after 200, beyond the artillery that fires 10 rounds for every German one, beyond the endless stream of Sherman tanks that are individually inferior to German panzers but arrive in overwhelming numbers, there's something else about the Americans that unnerves their enemies: their attitude. The Gestapo's 1944 analysis of American prisoners of war, archived as Barch R58 345, is remarkable for its bewildered tone. The interrogators are expecting ideological warriors. They're trained to break down prisoners by exploiting their beliefs, their fears, their loyalty to cause or country. American POWs break all their models. The report notes 78% of American prisoners express no hatred for Germans. When asked about their motivation for fighting, responses include, "It's my job, I got drafted, want to go home." Only 12% reference ideology or patriotism. This apolitical attitude is unprecedented in our interrogation experience. Recommendation: standard psychological approaches are ineffective. One interrogation transcript is preserved verbatim because the Gestapo officer found it so bizarre. Interrogator: why do you fight for Jewish international capitalism? American GI captured near Metz, September 1944. Can I get a Coke? Also, do you know the baseball scores? Interrogator: answer the question. Why do you fight? American GI: because you guys started it, I guess. Look, I was working in a garage in Detroit. Got drafted. Now I'm here. It's not personal. Interrogator: you have no conviction, no belief in your cause? American GI: my cause is going home. You going to surrender soon? That'd be great. This isn't cowardice or defeatism. The Gestapo's own analysis concludes American soldiers fight effectively despite their casual attitude. If anything, the lack of ideological fervour makes them more stable under pressure. They treat combat like an unpleasant job that needs completing, and you can't break the morale of men who weren't fighting for glory in the first place. Hauptmann Alexander Stahlberg of the 11th Panzer Division wrestles with this in his memoir Bounden Duty. They fight not for Führer or fatherland, but because it's Tuesday. When we captured a GI near Metz, he asked for a Coke and baseball scores, not political demands. How do you defeat an enemy who treats warfare as an inconvenient interruption to normal life? You don't. That's the answer German commanders are slowly, painfully reaching. You don't defeat the Americans through superior tactics or better trained soldiers, or even by winning individual battles. Because American warfare isn't about tactical brilliance. It's about overwhelming force applied with industrial efficiency until resistance becomes mathematically impossible. By 1945, when captured Wehrmacht General Franz Antonilla is asked why Germany lost the war, his response is immediate. Your trucks never broke down. Our horses never worked. It's not a joke. It's the most honest assessment of American military power ever given by a German officer. The United States brought industrial-age total war to a conflict Germany was still fighting with hybrid, mechanized and pre-industrial logistics. German infantry divisions relied on 5,000 horses for supply transport. American divisions had trucks that ran reliably, trucks that could be replaced, trucks supported by a logistical system so robust it's still studied in military academies today. The Americans didn't outfight the Germans. They outproduced them, outsupplied them, and crushed them under a weight of material no amount of tactical skill could overcome. Oberst von Luck, watching his panzers run out of fuel in Normandy, while American tanks refueled from jerry cans that seemed to appear by magic, finally understands what he glimpsed at Kasserine, Pass. We are mechanics trying to win a race against a factory. Every tank we destroy, they build 3 more. Every soldier we kill, 5 more arrive. We're not fighting an army. We're fighting an entire economy. And if the Americans represented the future of industrial warfare, impersonal, efficient, and unstoppable, the British represented something equally terrifying but far older. They represented an empire's 4 centuries of experience in the business of war. El Alamein, Egypt, November 2nd, 1942. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stands in his command post, reading a letter he'll send to his wife Lucy that evening. Outside, the Afrika Korps is collapsing. Not breaking, collapsing. There's a difference. Breaking implies sudden failure, panic, rout. What's happening to his divisions is slower, more inexorable, like a building ground down by termites until the structure simply can't stand anymore. The Tommies dig in like termites, he writes, his handwriting growing more agitated. Even when we break their lines, they cling to rubble and die rather than retreat. This isn't admiration, it's horror. Rommel has fought the British across North Africa for 2 years. He's beaten them at Gazala, outmanoeuvred them at Tobruk, humiliated them in a dozen smaller engagements. He understands their doctrine, recognizes their patterns, respects their professionalism. But at El Alamein, facing Bernard Montgomery's meticulously planned offensive, Rommel is experiencing something that Wehrmacht tactical training never prepared him for. The British don't fight to win ground. They fight to hold it. Every position the Afrika Korps overruns in counterattack, they find the same thing. British soldiers who fought to the last round, dead at their posts. Weapons aimed at the approaches. No white flags. No surrenders, unless physically incapacitated. Just bodies in positions that suggest they knew death was coming and decided to sell their lives for time. Time for the next British unit to dig in. Time for artillery to register the position. Time for the methodical, grinding, utterly relentless advance to resume. It's not normal soldier behaviour, writes Unteroffizier Ralph Munk of the 15th Panzer Division, documenting what he's witnessed at El Alamein. British wounded refuse morphine until after their mates are treated. They apologise for causing trouble when we take them prisoner. Their officers die leading from the front wearing neckties. Who wears a necktie to a battle? The British, apparently. because even in the mechanized hell of 20th century warfare, they carry 4 centuries of imperial military tradition, like armour. This creates a psychological problem for German commanders that's fundamentally different from the American challenge, the Americans' overwhelm with material. The British unnerve with predictability. Major Hans von der Heydter, commander of the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, experiences this at Caen in June 1944. His paratroopers are elite troops, veterans of Crete and the Eastern Front. They're dug into excellent defensive positions around the city, and they're watching British armour advance with the precision of a railway schedule. Von der Heydter's after-action report reads, "Their tanks advance exactly 200 metres, then stop to bombard us with coordinated fire. After precisely 4 minutes, they advance another 200 metres. It's maddening, like playing chess against a computer. We cannot exploit their mistakes because they make none. We cannot predict their movements because they follow a pattern we cannot break. 200 metres, 4 minutes, 200 metres, 4 minutes. Over and over. With mechanical consistency, British armour grinds forward. German anti-tank crews destroy Shermans and Cromwells. The British lose dozens of tanks around Caen. But the advance never wavers. Destroyed tanks are replaced. The timetable adjusts by minutes, not hours, and the grinding advance resumes. We can defeat their attacks, von der Heydter continues. We cannot stop their advance. There is a difference. And there is. The British aren't trying to win through tactical brilliance or operational shock. They're applying sustained, methodical pressure that acknowledges losses as inevitable and plans for them in advance. It's warfare as engineering problem, and the British have been solving it since Marlborough fought at Blenheim. But it's the small things, the cultural peculiarities that filter through military necessity, that truly disturb German soldiers facing the British. Lieutenant Hans von Lindorf, serving as a medic at Monte Cassino in early 1944, documents an incident that captures this perfectly. His aid station captures several wounded British soldiers from the 4th Indian Division after a failed assault on the Abbey. Von Lindorf speaks passable English and tries to make the wounded comfortable. "I offered morphine to a Tommy with shrapnel wounds," he writes in his diary. "He refused until I'd treated his corporal first, a man less seriously injured. When I insisted, he said, and I quote, 'Wouldn't be proper, sir, he's senior.' The man was bleeding heavily and concerned about propriety. Another wounded British soldier asks if it's possible to have tea. Not water. Tea. Von Lindorf, bemused, actually manages to brew some using captured British rations. The wounded soldier thanks him with genuine politeness, as if they're at a cafe rather than in a cave being shelled by American artillery. Their officers led charges wearing neckties. Von Lindorf concludes, it was beyond comprehension. This isn't just eccentricity. It's the manifestation of a military culture so deeply embedded that it persists even when tactically disadvantageous. The British fight as their grandfathers did at the Somme, as their great-grandfathers did in the Crimea, carrying regimental pride and class structure into the mechanized age. And somehow, impossibly, it works. Kapitan Lieutenant T.S. Schaefer, commanding U-boat U-277, experiences perhaps the most British moment of the entire war in May 1945. His submarine has been captured by Royal Navy destroyers. The crew is being transferred to a British vessel as prisoners. And the captured Royal Navy sailors previously held on the U-boat, seized weeks earlier from a sunken convoy escort, are being repatriated. Schaefer watches in disbelief as the British sailors, despite being prisoners for weeks, despite being half-starved and exhausted, demand proper tea time before debriefing. Not request. Demand. An officer explains to the bewildered German captain that Royal Navy regulations specify tea intervals regardless of circumstances. "It was the most British thing I ever witnessed," Schaefer writes in his log. "Even in defeat, even as prisoners, they were more concerned with maintaining routine than with survival itself. This obsession with procedure extends to combat operations in ways that baffle German tactical thinking. Sturmmann Fritz Krüger of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division fights British and Canadian forces in the grinding house-to-house battles around Caen. His unit is accustomed to urban combat from the Eastern Front, where Soviet tactics involve aggressive building-to-building assaults, often at night, with high casualties but rapid territorial gains. The British-Canadian approach is entirely different. They clear houses room by room, Krüger notes in a letter home dated July 1944. One room at a time, with grenades and systematic searches. Americans would have called in naval guns and erased the block. The British will spend an entire day clearing a single street. But when they're done, that street stays cleared. We can't infiltrate back because they've left nothing alive. This methodical approach, slow, costly in time but conservative with lives, reflects a strategic calculation the Americans don't make. The British are fighting with an all-volunteer army supplemented by limited conscription from a population of 48 million. They can't afford to waste soldiers the way the Americans can replace them. So British tactics emphasize firepower and preparation over aggressive maneuver. And when British soldiers do attack, they do so with planning that German commanders find both impressive and frustrating. Operation Goodwood, the massive British armoured offensive of July 1944, exemplifies this. Montgomery assembles 3 armoured divisions, over 100 tanks, for a breakthrough attempt near Caen. The preliminary bombardment involves 2,000 aircraft and hundreds of artillery pieces. German positions are pulverised, and then British armour advances with careful coordination, supporting infantry and methodical clearing of each defensive line. The attack gains only a few miles. The British lose over 400 tanks. By conventional measures, it's a failure. But General Lieutenant Heinrich Severloh, commanding Panzer Group West, sees something different. They tied down our entire Panzer Reserve. For 5 days, their losses were heavy but sustainable. Ours were not. And while we fought them at Caen, the Americans broke out at Saint-Lô. This was not a failed offensive. It was a deliberate fixing action. They sacrificed their tanks to lock us in place. The British are playing strategic chess while fighting tactical battles. Every grinding, costly, seemingly wasteful attack serves a larger operational purpose. And German commanders, trained to think in terms of decisive battlefield victory, struggle to counter an enemy for whom battlefield results are less important than strategic positioning. But perhaps nothing unnerves German soldiers more than British operations in darkness. The Phantom Patrols of Holland, October 1944. Wehrmacht units defending the approaches to Arnhem report something that borders on psychological warfare. British commandos, men trained in the Fairbairn-Sykes method of silent killing, veterans of raids across occupied Europe, conduct night patrols that seem designed less to gather intelligence than to terrorize. Sentries disappear without sound. Positions wake to find throats cut, no alarms raised. German units start doubling and tripling guard shifts, but exhaustion sets in. The British patrols are irregular, unpredictable, and devastatingly effective. Obergefreiter Klaus Dietrich documents the psychological toll. We cannot sleep. Every sound is a British commando. Yesterday they killed 4 men at our forward position. We found the bodies at dawn, all killed with knives. No shots fired. How do you fight ghosts? This is the British expertise that 4 centuries of colonial warfare, commando raids, and special operations have perfected. While Americans excel at overwhelming force, the British have mastered the art of precision violence applied at the perfect moment for maximum effect. And when combined, American material abundance supporting British tactical expertise, the result is unstoppable. Untersturmführer Rudolf Schröder of the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, hasn't slept in 73 hours. His unit, Fanatical teenagers indoctrinated since childhood, trained to believe themselves superior to any enemy, is learning a brutal lesson in the fields around Caen. They're caught between two nightmares. To the north and east, British and Canadian forces grind forward with artillery barrages that turn Norman countryside into moonscape. To the west, American infantry surge in chaotic waves that seem to ignore casualties and conventional tactics. And Schroeder's division, Germany's strategic reserve, meant to throw the invasion back into the sea, is being ground to pieces trying to fight both. The Americans charge machine guns without cover. Schroeder writes in his diary on June 8th, his handwriting shaky from exhaustion and suppressed trauma. At first we laughed. Hitlerjugend are trained to hold fire until optimal range, then cut them down efficiently. We did. They kept coming. Wave after wave. We stopped laughing when we ran out of ammunition. The tactical whiplash is destroying German defensive coherence faster than Allied bullets. Schroeder's company spends the morning of June 12th defending against an American probe near St. Lo. The Americans attack with minimal reconnaissance, seemingly improvising their assault based on terrain they're seeing for the first time. It's tactically unsound. Schroeder's men repel the attack, inflict heavy casualties, feel the satisfaction of superior training defeating amateur aggression. Then, that afternoon, his company is rushed north to counter a British advance near Caen. Everything changes. The British have registered every approach with artillery. They advance behind a creeping barrage that forces Schroeder's men into cover. When the Germans emerge to fire, British tanks, positioned with clear fields of fire, suppress them with coordinated volleys. The British infantry doesn't charge. They methodically clear each position with grenades, covering fire and careful teamwork. Schroeder's company takes more casualties in 2 hours against the British than they did all morning against the Americans. But the nature of the combat feels entirely different. Against the Americans, they felt like they were stopping a flood. Exhausting, but comprehensible. Against the British, they feel like pieces being moved on a chessboard by a player who's already calculated the endgame. This is the unique hell of Normandy 1944. German units must mentally shift between fighting two fundamentally different armies, sometimes within the same day. Obersturmbannführer Kurt Meyer, commanding the 12th SS Panzer Division, tries to explain the problem to his superior, General Oberst Hans von Salmuth. Against the Americans, we must fight mobile defence, counterattack quickly, and disengage before their artillery responds. Against the British, we must dig deep, endure bombardment, and hold ground because they'll consolidate anything we yield. These are opposite tactical requirements. My men are confused, exhausted, and dying because we cannot fight two different wars simultaneously. But they have no choice. The Allied bridgehead is expanding, and German units are plugging gaps wherever breakthrough threatens. One day, fighting Americans in the hedgerows near Carentan. The next day, facing British armour on the Caen plain. No time to adjust doctrine, retrain instincts, or even properly brief soldiers on what enemy they're about to face. The results are catastrophic. Hauptmann Wilhelm Schütz of Panzerlehr Division keeps a detailed tactical log that illustrates the problem. On June 15th, his battalion faces American infantry in close terrain near Trèbehau. His after-action notes: enemy advances with poor fire discipline, excessive ammunition expenditure, minimal use of cover. We inflict 3.1 casualty ratio. Successful defence. On June 17th, the same battalion redeploys to face British forces near Villers-Bocage. Schütz's notes: enemy advances behind precise artillery screen. Our counter-battery fire ineffective. They've located our guns through aerial reconnaissance. When we manoeuvre to flank their armour, we encounter infantry in prepared positions we didn't know existed. They'd reconnoitred our likely approaches. We suffer 40% casualties and failed to halt their advance. The same battalion, the same soldiers, two completely different outcomes based solely on which enemy they're facing. And the British-American coordination, despite the famous rivalry between Montgomery and Eisenhower, is grinding the Wehrmacht to pieces through complementary pressure. When Americans attack at Saint-Lô in mid-July, German panzer reserves rush west to contain the breakthrough. Immediately, British forces launch Operation Goodwood at Caen, forcing those same panzer units to rush east. The Germans exhaust themselves shuttling between crises, burning irreplaceable fuel, breaking down vehicles, and losing the strategic initiative completely. Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein of Panzerlehr experiences this firsthand. His division moves west to face the American Operation Cobra on July 25th. The preliminary bombardment over 2,400 Allied aircraft dropping bombs, followed by massed artillery, is unlike anything Bayerlein experienced in Russia or North Africa. "It was hell," he reports. "The entire landscape was transformed. Trees became splinters. Buildings became dust. My forward position simply ceased to exist. And then the Americans came, not with tactics, but with momentum. Tanks, infantry, engineers, all moving together in a flood." Panzerlehr, one of Germany's elite divisions, ceases to exist as a coherent formation. Bayerlein escapes with perhaps 30% of his men. The division is effectively destroyed. Meanwhile, British forces continue their methodical pressure at Caen, preventing any German withdrawal or regrouping. The strategic vice is tightening, and Wehrmacht commanders are receiving reports that sound like dispatches from two different wars. From the American sector, enemy attacks with minimal preparation, but overwhelming firepower. Artillery support is immediate and excessive. Air support is constant. Soldiers advance despite heavy casualties. Morale appears unaffected by losses. Recommend immediate reinforcement. From the British sector, enemy advances methodically behind comprehensive bombardment. All approaches are registered. Counterattacks are anticipated and countered. Positions lost cannot be retaken. Attrition is unsustainable. Recommend strategic withdrawal. But there's nowhere to withdraw to. Rommel, still nominally in command of Army Group B, can only watch as his forces are systematically destroyed by an enemy that attacks like a force of nature in one sector and a precision instrument in another. The Canadians add another dimension to German misery. Fighting as part of the British operational framework, but with a ferocity that reminds German. Veterans of the Eastern Front, Canadian forces earn a reputation that terrifies. Sturmann Kruger, fighting at Caen, notes, "The Canadians fight like the British, methodically, with proper preparation, but they don't take prisoners as readily." After what happened at Ardennes Abbey, where 12th SS executed Canadian PWs, they come at us with a hatred the British don't show. It's the worst combination, British tactics with Soviet ruthlessness. By late July, German defensive cohesion in Normandy is collapsing not because of any single tactical defeat, but because the Wehrmacht is being forced to fight on two fronts that require mutually exclusive tactical responses, and they're losing both. The Falaise Pocket in August becomes the final demonstration of Anglo-American complementary warfare. The Americans, led by Patton's aggressive armoured thrust, race around the German southern flank with the kind of audacious mobility that German blitzkrieg pioneers recognise and can't counter because they lack fuel and tanks. Simultaneously, Canadian and British forces press from the north with methodical, irresistible pressure. The German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army are caught in between. Over 50,000 German soldiers are captured. Another 10,000 are killed in the pocket. The survivors escape only because Patton's aggressive advance creates a narrow gap, a gap that British forces, moving more cautiously, might have closed, but also might never have created through the rapid encirclement in the first place. It's the perfect metaphor for Anglo-American cooperation. American aggression creates the opportunity. British consolidation prevents German exploitation. Together, they're achieving what neither could accomplish alone. Oberst von Luck, escaping the Falaise pocket with the shattered remnants of the 21st Panzer Division, summarizes it in a single diary entry. "We trained to fight the last war. The Americans are fighting the next one. The British are fighting this one perfectly. And we are dying." Prisoner of war camp, Devizes, England. December 1944. General-Lieutenant Franz Antonilla sits across from his British interrogator, a cup of actual tea steaming between them. He's been a prisoner since the Falaise pocket, and he's spent 4 months thinking about the question the interrogator has just asked. Why did Germany lose? Antonilla doesn't hesitate. "Your trucks never broke down. Our horses never worked." The interrogator pauses, pen hovering over his notepad. "I'm sorry. Could you elaborate?" "We mobilized for modern war with a pre-modern economy," Antonilla explains, and suddenly he's talking rapidly, as if releasing pressure that's been building for months. The average German infantry division relied on 5,000 horses for supply transport. Horses that needed food, that fell sick, that died from exhaustion. Your soldiers rode in trucks that ran for thousands of miles. Do you understand what that means strategically? Every offensive we launched was constrained by how far our horses could drag supplies. Yours just kept coming. This conversation, preserved in British interrogation archives, represents a shift in how Germans talk about the war once captured. The propaganda evaporates. The ideological certainty crumbles. What remains are professional soldiers trying to understand how they lost to enemies they often defeated tactically. And their answers reveal something profound about the nature of modern warfare. The classified interrogation reports from 1944-1945 show a pattern. German officers express less hatred for their captors than Allied intelligence expects. Instead, they demonstrate professional curiosity, bordering on obsession about Allied methods, logistics, and most surprisingly, culture. Oberst Hans von Luck, interrogated after his capture in 1945, spends more time asking questions than answering them. He wants to know about American supply chains. How do forward units receive ammunition so quickly? What's the system for vehicle replacement? How is artillery coordination so responsive? His interrogator notes, subject displays no animosity, appears genuinely interested in Allied operational procedures. When informed that American supply doctrine prioritizes redundancy over efficiency, subject responded, "That explains everything. We optimized for perfection. You optimized for reliability. In war, reliability wins." But it's the cultural observations, the human details that transcend tactics, that fill page after page of interrogation reports. Major Klaus Fischer, the SS intelligence officer who authored the 1944 Tactical Comparison Report, is captured near Bremen in April 1945. His interrogation reveals a man fascinated by the psychological dimension of Allied soldiers. "The Americans confused us," he admits. "Soviet soldiers fought for survival and ideology. British fought for king and country. We fought for Führer and fatherland. But Americans? When we asked captured GIs why they fought, they'd say things like, 'I got drafted,' or 'want to finish this and go home.' How do you break the morale of men who aren't fighting for anything except the desire to stop fighting?" His interrogator presses, "Did that make them less effective?" "No," Fischer responds immediately. "It made them more dangerous. Ideological soldiers can be demoralized if you damage their cause. Professional soldiers can be defeated if you destroy their pride. But American soldiers treated combat like an unpleasant job. You can't demoralize someone who's already emotionally detached from the conflict. They just wanted it finished efficiently." This apolitical pragmatism, documented in the Gestapo's own bewildered POW analysis, represents something Wehrmacht doctrine had no framework to counter. German soldiers were raised in a culture of duty, sacrifice, and national glory. Finding enemies who cared about none of these things and fought effectively anyway was cognitively disorienting. The British inspired different but equally confused admiration. Hauptmann Hans von Lindorf, the medic from Monte Cassino, is captured in Italy and spends months in a POW camp alongside British soldiers before being transferred to a camp for German prisoners. The experience leaves him more impressed with his former enemies than his own side. Even as prisoners, they maintained structure, he writes in a letter to his wife in 1946. They organized themselves by rank and regiment. They held formations. One officer insisted on maintaining boot polish standards in a prison camp. At first I thought it was madness. Then I realized this is how they survived. The British don't bend. They simply apply their rules regardless of circumstance, and somehow this makes them unbreakable. But perhaps the most revealing post-war conversations happen years later, when the bitterness fades and honest assessment becomes possible. In 1980, American 101st Airborne veteran David Webster attends a veterans reunion in Germany. He's written a memoir about his experiences, later used as source material for Band of Brothers, and he's invited to speak with former Wehrmacht soldiers who fought against the Allies. One of them is Peter Ree, who served in the Fallschirmjäger and fought both American and British forces. Webster, curious, asked the question, "Who scared you more, us or the British?" Ree considers carefully before responding. "You had the machines, they had the soul." Webster asks him to elaborate. "Your soldiers were kids from farms and cities," Ree explains. "They didn't want to be there, but you gave them so much material support that their inexperience didn't matter. Endless ammunition, responsive artillery, air support, we couldn't match. Fighting you was like fighting a factory that produced death." And the British? The British were professional killers wearing polite manners. They said please and thank you while calling artillery strikes. They apologized when taking you prisoner, but they'd been running an empire for centuries and they knew how to break resistance. Not through overwhelming force, but through relentless, methodical pressure that never stopped. Another veteran, Hans Woltersdorf, who fought at Caen, adds his perspective. Americans would charge a position 3 times, lose men each time, and charge a 4th time with the same enthusiasm. Insane, but effective. British would charge once, fail, pull back, and return 3 days later with a complete solution to why they failed the first time. Both approaches worked. Both were terrifying in different ways. These conversations, dozens of them preserved in veteran oral histories, reveal a common theme. German soldiers developed profound respect for enemies they couldn't defeat, not because of superior individual skill, but because of superior systems. The Americans built a military machine that turned industrial capacity into combat power with ruthless efficiency. The British refined 4 centuries of imperial warfare into a doctrine that emphasized sustainable pressure over dramatic victory. And together they represented an overwhelming force that German tactical excellence could slow but never stop. Oberstleutnant Wilhelm Schütz, interviewed in 1991 for a documentary, perhaps summarizes it best. "We thought warfare was about tactics, training and will. The Americans taught us it was about logistics. The British taught us it was about endurance. And together they taught us that modern war is won not on the battlefield, but in factories, shipping lanes, and the political will to sustain losses we could never replace." The human element, the cultural foundations that shaped how democracies fight, proved more powerful than German military tradition could counter. Allied intelligence officers have assembled captured German generals for a systematic debriefing unlike any conducted during the war. No propaganda, no immediate tactical urgency, just professional military analysis of what went wrong, preserved for historical record and future doctrine development. The classified report that emerges, portions declassified in the 1970s, represents the most honest German military assessment of Anglo-American forces ever compiled. Section 4, titled Comparative Analysis, British versus American Combat Effectiveness, runs to 47 pages. But its conclusions can be summarized in the words of General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, former commander of Panzer Lehr. Against the Americans, we lost quickly. Against the British, we lost inevitably. Against both simultaneously, we never had a chance. The report breaks down combat effectiveness by specific military function, using data from thousands of after-action reports, casualty analyses, and ground-level observations. What emerges is a portrait of two armies that were superior to German forces in completely different ways. British rating, superior American rating, adequate German assessment, British commando training, particularly Fairbairn-Sykes knife combat methodology, exceeded SS standards. British infantry demonstrated superior small unit tactics in confined terrain. American infantry relied on firepower over technique, but achieved tactical objectives through material superiority. The numbers support this. In house-to-house fighting, Italy, Caen, Aachen, British-Canadian forces consistently inflicted higher casualty ratios against German defenders than American forces in similar terrain. But American forces took objectives faster by bypassing strong resistance and using overwhelming fire support to neutralize positions rather than clear them methodically. British rating, effective American rating, devastating German assessment. American artillery response averaged 3 minutes from forward observer call to impact. British averaged 7 minutes, but with superior accuracy and coordination with ground forces. German average, 15 minutes. This discrepancy alone made defensive operations unsustainable. The report includes specific examples. At Mortain in August 1944, American forward observers called 4,500 artillery missions in 3 days, breaking up the last major German offensive in Normandy before it could achieve breakthrough. British artillery at El Alamein fired 600 guns in coordinated barrages that German counter-battery fire couldn't silence because British planning had established redundant fire positions. The verdict: we could not mass for offensive action because American artillery destroyed concentrations immediately. We could not defend static positions because British artillery reduced them systematically. British rating, superior American rating, avoided when possible. German assessment, British night patrols in Holland and Italy induced psychological casualties that exceeded physical losses. American forces preferred to use darkness for resupply and reorganization. British commandos used darkness as a weapon. The phantom patrols of Operation Market Garden, the SAS raids behind German lines, the systematic intimidation of German forward positions through silent kills. These operations appear repeatedly in German reports, with language that suggests trauma rather than tactical analysis. One officer notes, Americans owned the day through air superiority. British owned the night through expertise we could not match. British rating, methodical American rating, exceptional. Here the German assessment becomes almost admiring. American forces improvise solutions to tactical problems with remarkable speed, often violating their own doctrine. British forces adhered to established procedure but modified doctrine between engagements. Both approaches proved effective. The report cites specific examples. American engineers at Remagen seizing the bridge and establishing a bridgehead before higher command even knew the opportunity existed. British forces at Mareth, systematically revising their assault plan after initial failures, returning with solutions to every German defensive measure. Americans thrived in chaos, the assessment concludes. British eliminated chaos through planning. Against either, we struggled. Against both, we drowned. Logistics and sustainability. British rating. Adequate. American rating. Unprecedented. This section reads like German officers processing trauma through statistical analysis. The numbers are staggering. American forces in Europe consumed 800,000 tons of supplies monthly. By late 1944, German forces defending against them received 100,000 tons. Monthly British forces maintained 90 and 95% vehicle operational readiness. German forces averaged 60% by 1944, dropping to 35% by 1945. We calculated ammunition expenditure by rounds, one officer notes. Americans calculated by tons. This is not a doctrinal difference, it's a fundamental mismatch in industrial capacity. But the most damning assessment comes in the report's summary section, authored collectively by the assembled generals. The American and British armies represented two different solutions to modern warfare, but both solutions were superior to our approach because they were sustainable. We built a military designed to win quick, decisive victories. The Allies built militaries designed to win long wars of attrition. When the war became the latter, as it inevitably did given our strategic overreach, the outcome was predetermined. The report includes one final observation that cuts to the heart of why Germany lost. We fought with excellence. They fought with sufficiency. In total war, sufficiency that can be sustained defeats excellence that cannot be replaced. This wasn't a failure of German tactics or courage. It was the recognition that modern industrial warfare rewards different virtues than traditional military culture emphasized. The Americans proved that overwhelming material superiority can compensate for tactical inexperience. The British proved that methodical professionalism can achieve victory without tactical brilliance. And together, the American factory and the British Empire, they created a military combination that German excellence could bloody but never break. Lieutenant Walter Kasper's diary entry from April 1945, written days before his capture, perhaps captures the emotional reality beneath the statistical analysis. The British fought with tradition. The Americans fought with the future, and we fought with pride. Pride doesn't stop artillery shells or replace destroyed tanks. We lost not because we weren't good enough, but because good enough was redefined by enemies who changed the nature of warfare itself. In the classrooms of the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, future officers study a case study that would have been impossible in 1945, the Wehrmacht's defensive operations in Normandy. Not to glorify the enemy, but to understand what German commanders got right, and more importantly, what they got wrong about the nature of modern warfare. The lessons drawn from those desperate weeks in 1944 shaped military doctrine for the next 80 years. Because what German soldiers experienced fighting Americans and British wasn't just tactical defeat. It was a fundamental lesson in how democratic societies wage war differently than authoritarian ones, and why those differences matter more than individual battlefield outcomes. NATO itself is the institutional legacy of what Germans learned too late. The alliance that has defended Europe since 1949 combines American material superiority with European tactical sophistication. It's a deliberately engineered synthesis of the two nightmares Wehrmacht commanders faced: overwhelming firepower married to methodical professionalism. The American approach, rapid artillery response, emphasis on logistics, overwhelming air support, became NATO's foundation for defeating Soviet mass. The British approach, careful planning, sustainable operations, professional military culture, became the framework that made American power strategically coherent rather than just tactically devastating. Modern American military doctrine still bears the fingerprints of what worked in 1944. The ability to project power globally relies on logistics systems that trace their design to Red Ball express supply routes. Artillery coordination that can strike targets within minutes comes from doctrines developed in Normandy. The integration of air and ground forces that defines American operational art evolved from lessons learned supporting ground troops against Wehrmacht defenders. But the deeper legacy isn't tactical, it's philosophical. The Germans feared American abundance because it represented a kind of warfare their culture couldn't comprehend. War as industrial process rather than heroic struggle. There was no glory in American artillery saturation, no honour in calling airstrikes on individual strongpoints, no martial virtue in replacing casualties faster than the enemy could inflict them. Yet it worked, and in working it revealed something profound. Modern war rewards efficient application of resources more than individual courage or tactical brilliance. The Germans produced the world's finest tank, the Tiger, and lost to endless streams of inferior but reliable Shermans. They trained elite infantry to professional standards Americans couldn't match, and those elite infantry were ground down by conscripts supported with artillery the Germans couldn't answer. Excellence is a luxury. Sufficiency is a strategy. The Germans feared British persistence because it reflected something their ideology rejected: the power of sustainable, methodical effort over dramatic gesture. Nazi culture celebrated the decisive victory, the crushing blow, the dramatic breakthrough. British military culture, forged over centuries of colonial warfare, understood that empires are maintained through boring competence applied consistently over time. Monte Cassino took 4 months and massive casualties to capture, an operational failure by German standards. But Montgomery's strategy didn't require victory at Cassino. It required that German forces stayed pinned there while Allied power built up elsewhere. The British lost the battle and won the campaign because they understood that strategic patience defeats tactical brilliance. These lessons echo forward. When military historians analyse why insurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan proved so challenging for American forces, part of the answer lies in the same cultural DNA that terrified Wehrmacht soldiers. American doctrine assumes that overwhelming firepower and material superiority will create conditions for victory. Against enemies who fight through persistence, avoid decisive battle, and measure success in decades rather than months, the American approach struggles. Conversely, British experiences in Northern Ireland, Malaya, and other long-term counter-insurgency operations drew on the same methodical, patient approach that Germans found so unnerving in Normandy, not seeking dramatic victory, but applying sustainable pressure until resistance becomes untenable. But perhaps the most important legacy is what this comparison reveals about democratic warfare itself. The Americans and British won not because democracies are inherently more moral. Both nations committed acts in World War II that deserve critical examination, but because democratic governance creates military structures that are resilient, adaptable, and sustainable in ways authoritarian militaries struggle to match. The American GI asking for Coke and baseball scores while being interrogated represents something powerful. Soldiers who fight effectively without ideological fervour, who treat warfare as a job rather than a crusade, are paradoxically more dangerous than fanatics. They don't need propaganda to maintain morale. They don't require belief in a cause to follow orders. They simply want the job done so they can go home, and they'll apply whatever force is necessary to finish it. The British soldier maintaining tea time as a prisoner represents something equally powerful: cultural confidence so deep it persists regardless of circumstances. That kind of unshakable identity, rooted in centuries of institutional memory, creates military forces that don't break under pressure because their cohesion doesn't depend on immediate victory. Together, they embodied what terrified German commanders most: enemies who couldn't be psychologically defeated, because they weren't psychologically vulnerable in the ways authoritarian military culture understood. Today, the question Peter Ree posed to David Webster, "You had the machines, they had the soul," still resonates. Modern militaries worldwide study the Wehrmacht's tactical excellence. German combined arms doctrine, operational manoeuvre, and military professionalism remain gold standards in military education. But they also study why that excellence lost to sufficiency. Because the real lesson of World War II's Western Front isn't about tactics or courage, or even technology. It's about systems. The Americans built systems that turned industrial capacity into combat power. The British built systems that made military tradition operationally relevant in mechanized warfare. The Germans built brilliant soldiers and gave them unsustainable missions. In total war, which all modern wars between peer competitors risk becoming, sustainability defeats brilliance every time. For us, as viewers trying to understand history's lessons, this comparison offers something beyond military arcana. It reveals how cultures shape the way nations fight, how different approaches to the same problem can all work effectively, and how the side that wins isn't always the one with the best soldiers. It's the one whose society is best structured to support continuous military effort. The German veterans who spoke honestly about their fears weren't admitting cowardice. They were recognizing that they'd fought enemies who'd found different answers to warfare's fundamental problem: how to break the enemy's will while sustaining your own. The Americans answered, overwhelm them with material until resistance becomes mathematically futile. The British answered, pressure them methodically until resistance becomes unsustainable. Both answers worked. Both were terrifying. And both reflect something essential about the societies that produced them. One defined by industrial abundance and frontier pragmatism, the other by imperial endurance and institutional memory. Lieutenant Walter Casper's final assessment endures: the British fought with tradition, the Americans fought with the future. And in 1944-1945, tradition and future together defeated a German military excellence that belonged to neither, trapped between a past it idealized and a future it couldn't match. The soldiers on all sides deserve remembrance for their courage, but the lesson deserves study for its wisdom. In modern warfare, how your society organizes itself matters more than how brave your soldiers are. The Americans and British won not because they were braver than the Germans, but because their systems, political, industrial, cultural, were better designed for the kind of war the 20th century demanded. That lesson remains relevant anywhere nations prepare for conflict. Because wars are won not on battlefields alone, but in factories, logistics networks, training systems, and the cultural foundations that make societies willing to sustain long, costly struggles. The Germans learned this too late. We have the advantage of learning it from their testimony. If this story revealed something you didn't know about World War II, drop a comment about which part surprised you most. And if you want to dive deeper into untold war stories told through primary sources, subscribe, because there are dozens more accounts like this waiting to be told. The Germans feared both nightmares. Now you know why.